Welcome to today's deep dive. This one is titled In Search of the Optimal System, Stress Testing the Architecture. And we are looking at a really dense, quite fascinating set of source materials today.
Yeah, we really are. We have an audio recording and a fairly comprehensive set of presentation slides to go through. And these originate from the 5th university lecture delivered by Professor Wojan Zink.
Right. And just to give you a bit of perspective on what this material actually represents, Professor Hoyink has been engaged in a rather ambitious long-term project.
He has. He is attempting to outline a highly structured algorithmic political and economic system. If you look at the progression of his earlier lectures, it is essentially an exercise in designing a state apparatus entirely from the ground up.
And he's utilizing strict systems theory and engineering principles to do it.
Exactly. So today we are examining the phase of the project where he actively stress tests this architecture. We will be analyzing how he addresses his critics, how he establishes new structural rules, and quite significantly how he patches vulnerabilities in the system.
Vulnerabilities that were actually identified in real time. He held a remarkably intensive question and answer session with his audience, and we have the audio of that.
Which makes for great source material because you get to hear the theory collide with actual human skepticism.
Right. Now, a quick note before we dive into the gears of this machine. The professor does not pull any punches in this lecture. He takes direct aim at heavily debated political and economic theories.
She certainly does.
Within these sources, you will hear critiques of left-wing thought, specifically Marxist economic analysis, as well as very pointed critiques of right-wing classical liberal economic models.
So we need to be clear about our position here.
Absolutely. As your guides through this material, our role is entirely neutral. We are not here to take a side, nor are we endorsing the professor's political or economic viewpoints.
Think of us simply as your mechanics for the day. We are just popping the hood to show you how his proposed engine works. We are impartially reporting on the mechanics of the system he proposes in the original source material.
It is a necessary distinction. We are evaluating the blueprint of a machine, testing the tension of its springs and the logic of its algorithms, rather than, advocating for its construction in the real world.
Which requires keeping a certain objective distance.
Precisely. So I invite you to keep a fundamental question in the back of your mind as we begin today. What does it actually take to build a political system from scratch?
And perhaps the more difficult question, how do you ensure that the system does not immediately buckle or break the moment human nature gets involved? Because human nature always involves self-interest and ambition.
That is the ultimate variable. Let us start by looking at the catalyst for this specific lecture, because the professor does not open with abstract theory. He starts by discussing a very real, very immediate situation that was occurring right outside his lecture hall.
Yeah, the context here grounds the entire theoretical discussion. The source material indicates that there were widespread student protests taking place. Students had been blocking universities and engaging in organized protests for nearly 4 months.
4 months. That is a sustained, incredibly complex organizational effort by thousands of individuals.
It is. And what captures the professor's analytical focus is not necessarily the specific demands of the students, but rather the method they use to govern themselves during this prolonged period.
Right, they organize their decision-making using a plenum system.
Let us establish exactly what that means, because the word plenum gets thrown around in political science, but the sources define it here with mechanical precision. It is a form of pure, direct democracy.
The students operating these plenums describe them as entirely open forums for all members of the collective. In this forum, absolute equality is the rule.
Meaning anyone can propose an item for the agenda?
Anyone. And everyone has an equal right to discuss that item for as long as they feel they need to.
And then decisions are ultimately made based on a simple majority vote of everyone present in the room. There are no elected leaders, there are no steering committees.
No representatives making choices on behalf of the group. It is a structure that completely flattens the traditional hierarchy.
It really does. And the professor begins his analysis by agreeing with the students on a fundamental, highly positive attribute of this system. Because the plenum operates as a pure, direct democracy, it is remarkably honest.
Honest in what way?
In the sense that, by its very design, it is almost entirely immune to standard political corruption.
I want to push on that for a second, because if you have hundreds of people in a room, couldn't someone still be bribed or influenced?
Well, on an individual level, perhaps, sure. But systemically, the corruption fails because there is no intermediary. Think about it. In a representative system, you elect one person to speak for 10,000 people.
Right.
If a corporation or a special interest group wants to influence policy, they only need to compromise that one representative. They can lobby them, fund their next campaign, offer them a lucrative board position later.
But in a plenum, there is no middleman to buy.
Exactly. To corrupt the outcome of a plenum, you would have to individually bribe a majority of the entire population participating in the forum. The decision-making power remains entirely decentralized. Therefore, the outcome is an honest reflection of the collective's will at that specific moment.
That sounds like an ideal scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, it removes the entire industry of lobbying overnight. But the professor quickly pivots to what he sees as the fatal flaw of this setup.
The structural breaking point.
Right. While the plenum guarantees an honest decision, he argues that pure direct democracy is catastrophically inefficient.
And he uses the reality of the student protests to demonstrate the math here. According to his observations in the lecture, these students were gathering for their plenums on a daily basis. They were engaging in open discussion from noon until 8 p.m.
That is an 8-hour daily commitment from a massive group of people, which is essentially a full-time job just to participate in governance.
And what was the tangible output of that massive expenditure of time and energy? The professor notes that after all those hours, week after week, they might produce only 2 or 3 actionable decisions a week.
But wait, let us consider the modern context for a moment. We have the internet, we have smartphones. Couldn't we just vote on proposals securely through an app? Why does he assume the process has to be this agonizingly slow?
That is a very common counterargument, but he argues it mistakes the act of voting for the process of deliberation. The bottleneck in a pure direct democracy is not the casting of the ballot. It is the formulation of the question and the debate over its merits.
Ah, I see.
If anyone can propose an agenda item and everyone has the right to speak on it, the deliberation phase stretches toward infinity. Even if the vote itself takes 5 seconds on a smartphone, the collective still has to read, analyze, debate, and amend the proposal before that vote can happen.
Because if you skip the deliberation, you aren't doing democracy. You were just taking a blind poll.
Precisely. So the bottleneck is the human capacity to process information and reach consensus, not the technology of the ballot box. And this leads to a rather striking thought experiment he poses to the audience.
He asks them to imagine scaling that plenum model up to govern a modern nation state.
Right. Think about the sheer volume of decisions a modern state makes daily. Operating the electrical grid, managing interest rates, adjusting import tariffs, dispatching emergency services, negotiating foreign treaties.
It's an endless stream of logistics.
If a country attempted to run its standard daily operations through a massive, constant plenum of all citizens, the timeline would stretch to an absurd degree. He uses a vivid analogy here.
The ages of the universe analogy.
Yes. He says a routine governmental decision that currently takes a few days to resolve in a representative system would take several ages of the universe to finalize in a pure, direct democracy.
It perfectly illustrates the core tension in any system of governance. You are constantly balancing effectiveness against efficiency.
It is the ultimate trade-off.
The plenum has incredibly high effectiveness. It makes the honest, uncorrupted decision. But it possesses virtually zero efficiency. Conversely, a representative democracy is highly efficient. A small group of elected officials can pass a $1 trillion budget in a weekend.
But it frequently suffers from low effectiveness. It is highly susceptible to corruption, party whips, and representatives simply ignoring the will of the people who elected them.
Which brings us to the central thesis of the professor's entire project. He argues that a functional, optimal society cannot rely on either extreme.
We cannot utilize the pure direct democracy of the student plenum because the state would paralyze itself and collapse. But we also cannot settle for the inherently flawed representative democracies we currently operate under, because they inevitably drift toward oligarchy or corruption.
So his solution is to design a system that utilizes specific rigid algorithms to forcefully combine the two. He is attempting to build a machine that fuses the uncorruptible honesty of the plenum with the raw, functional efficiency of the representative model.
It is a monumental engineering challenge.
I think it is worth pausing here for you to consider this dynamic in your own life. Think about the balance between making the absolute perfect, consensus-driven decision in your household or your workplace versus just making a timely decision so you can actually move forward.
At a certain point, the relentless pursuit of a flawless process actively prevents anything from actually getting accomplished.
That inherent friction is precisely why he insists on defining strict mathematical rules for his system. He calls these rules axioms. They are the load-bearing pillars of his architecture.
And in this specific lecture, he introduces a new one to his listeners, which he designates as the 11th axiom. It deals specifically with the mechanics of political power, appointments, and oversight.
Let us unpack the 11th axiom, because the sources define it as addressing what we could call the appointment paradox. He states it as a mechanical, systemic impossibility.
The axiom dictates that it is impossible for person A to appoint person B to a position, retain the legal power to fire person B, and still logically expect person B to act as an independent, objective check on person A's power.
If we examine the broader landscape of modern governance, we immediately see why this is such a profound structural dilemma. In so many current political systems, a legislative assembly or a chief executive appoints the very individuals who are theoretically supposed to oversee, audit, or control them.
Let us run a hypothetical scenario to visualize how this fails. Imagine a prime minister who is facing allegations of financial impropriety. Under pressure, this prime minister appoints a highly respected judge to be the head of a new, independent anti-corruption agency.
The public applauds.
Exactly. But embedded in the legislation is a clause stating the prime minister retains the executive authority to dismiss the head of this agency at their discretion.
The relationship is fundamentally compromised from the moment the ink dries.
Completely. The appointee, no matter how morally upright they may be, is inherently constrained. They're operating with a sword hanging over their head. They know with absolute certainty that if they investigate their boss too aggressively, or if they uncover something truly damaging, they will simply be removed from their post before they can publish their findings.
It is an illusion of accountability. The system is built on an irreconcilable conflict of interest. The auditor cannot be independent if their livelihood and authority are tethered to the goodwill of the person they are auditing.
So what is the mechanical fix that the professor proposes for this paradox?
He argues that the solution must be hard-coded into the Constitution as a procedural algorithm. The rule must be absolute. If person A appoints person B, the power to remove person B must belong strictly and exclusively to someone else entirely.
We can call them person C.
Right. This person C could be an independent constitutional court, or it could be an entirely separate branch of government that has no overlapping interests with person A.
He provides a real-world parallel to illustrate that this isn't just a theoretical concept. It actually functions in practice when applied correctly. He points to the architecture of the United States Supreme Court.
Yes. The Supreme Court is a classic example of attempting to sever this exact paradox. In that specific system, the executive branch, the president, holds the power to appoint the judges. The legislative branch holds the power to confirm them. But the crucial mechanical intervention is that the judges are granted lifetime appointments.
And that lifetime tenure isn't just a perk of the job. It is a structural necessity to enforce the 11th axiom. It severs the threat of dismissal.
A president cannot fire a Supreme Court justice simply because the justice rules against the president's policies or strikes down their legislation. The appointer loses all leverage over the appointee the moment the confirmation is complete.
By institutionalizing this 11th axiom across all levels of his proposed architecture, the professor is seeking to systematically prevent what he views as the quiet dismantling of constitutional spirits.
Autocracies rarely announce themselves overnight. They usually happen when a single ruler or a dominant party technically follows the appointment rules, but practically controls all oversight mechanisms through the implicit, quiet threat of dismissal.
If the people auditing the ruler cannot be fired by the ruler is forced mechanically to operate within the actual bounds of the law.
So we have theoretically secured the political side of the state with these axioms. We have mechanisms to prevent the concentration of executive power, but political power is almost always downstream of economic power. Does the professor apply this same ruthless mechanical logic to the structure of the economy?
He does, and this is where the lecture shifts into a deeply analytical and highly critical review of historical economic models.
Again, navigating this requires strict neutrality from us, as we are simply outlining the professor's categorical definitions.
Of course, he begins his economic framing by directly critiquing Marx's theory. The source material notes a specific detail here. The professor states explicitly that he has read all 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital.
He doesn't just dismiss it out of hand. He offers a very specific, bifurcated assessment.
He concludes that Marx's analysis of the economy, specifically his diagnostic work regarding how exploitation mechanically occurs within industrial systems, was essentially perfect.
He acknowledges the diagnostic accuracy.
Yes. However, he argues that Marx's synthesis, The structural solution and the resulting worldview he proposed was a disaster.
According to the professor, Marx categorized society through a lens that was far too binary. He divided the economic world into two warring factions: the greedy, capital-hoarding owners and the exploited, laboring workers.
And the professor argues that by enforcing this strict binary, Marx fundamentally missed a vital component of human progress. He missed the value of the active entrepreneur.
Marx lumped the person who risks everything to build a new factory, invent a new product into the exact same category as a feudal lord simply collecting rent on land they inherited.
To provide the necessary contrast, the professor then pivots to critique the classical liberal economic view. He cites foundational economists of this school, such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek.
He notes that classical liberals tend to heavily idolize the entrepreneur, which is a position the professor actually agrees with.
But he identifies a severe blind spot in their philosophy as well. While they correctly identify the entrepreneur as the engine of progress, he argues that classical liberals frequently fail to distinguish between different types of wealth accumulation.
In their models, profit is profit.
Exactly. They tend to lump what economists call rentiers, passive earners, into the exact same protective category as active, value-creating entrepreneurs.
Let's pause there for a moment. For someone who isn't steeped in economic terminology, what exactly distinguishes a rentier in this context?
A rentier is someone who derives their income entirely from the ownership of property or capital without contributing any active labor or innovation to society.
Okay.
If you own an empty field and you charge people a toll simply to walk across it, you are extracting wealth without creating any new value. You aren't farming the field, you aren't building a road, you are simply monetizing your ownership title.
So the professor's arguing that classical liberalism fails to differentiate between the person who builds the road and the person who just puts a toll booth on a road that already exists.
That is his argument, yes. And this critique of both Marx and the classical liberals leads directly to the professor's own structural categorization.
He proposes redefining the entire economic space by dividing people not into two groups, but into three distinct categories. He refers to this as his economic triad.
The first group in this triad is the workers. In this specific categorization, he aligns somewhat with the Marxist diagnostic. He defines workers as those who rely entirely on wages for their survival and who are, structurally speaking, within the system, subject to exploitation.
The second group is the entrepreneurs. These are the active creators. In the professor's architecture, they're the ones who pull society forward. They assume risk, they generate real profit, they create tangible products and services.
They drive technological and social progress. And here is the crucial policy application attached to this group. The professor argues emphatically that entrepreneurs should not be heavily taxed.
His logic is that their active work is the primary engine that generates the wealth and progress that ultimately benefits the broader society. Penalizing the creation of real value slows the entire machine down.
But if you aren't heavily taxing the people generating the massive profits, how does the state fund itself? This leads us to the third group in the triad, which introduces a stark separation from both Marxist and classical liberal thought.
He identifies a group he calls the speculators.
The speculators are the passive extractors. The professor defines them meticulously. These are individuals or institutions that might buy thousands of shares on a stock exchange on a Tuesday, sell them on a Wednesday, and extract millions in wealth strictly through the resulting price differences.
They're exploiting the volatility of the market.
Precisely, and they do this without contributing any actual labor to the enterprise they are trading. They haven't improved the product, they haven't made the factory safer, they haven't managed a single worker.
They are generating no new tangible value for society. They are merely capturing wealth as it moves.
The critical policy distinction he makes is that, unlike the entrepreneurs, the speculators should be subject to heavy aggressive taxation. He argues that the immense wealth they are extracting from the financial system is essentially the captured sweat and labor of the first two groups, the workers and the active entrepreneurs.
By structurally identifying and heavily taxing the speculators, he claims his system captures the protective spirit of what Marx was originally attempting to target, the passive hoarding of wealth, without destroying the entrepreneurial engine that the classical liberals correctly identify as necessary for a thriving economy.
It is a fascinating reslicing of the economic pie.
Take a moment to consider how you view your own role in the economy based on this specific triad. When you look at your daily efforts, are you generating new, tangible value, or are your efforts focused on extracting value from existing systems?
It makes an abstract theoretical framework feel intensely personal when applied to how we spend our working lives.
Having laid out these foundational rules, the political axioms, and the economic triad, the professor then pivots to a critical and arguably the most engaging phase of the lecture, answering his critics.
He addresses specific structural objections that have been raised by participants and scholars in previous sessions regarding the architecture he is proposing.
The first major critique he tackles is what we could summarize as the 300-year-old blueprint argument. Critics look at his comprehensive proposal, which notably includes a newly invented, entirely separate fourth branch of government called the control branch.
And they object on historical grounds. They argue if the French philosopher Montesquieu's three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, were sufficient to govern Western democracies for centuries, why do we suddenly need to invent a fourth branch?
Montesquieu didn't include a control branch 300 years ago, so why is it necessary now?
To dismantle this critique, the professor dives deep into historical context. He argues that we have fundamentally misunderstood the environment Montesquieu was actually designing for.
He points out that Montesquieu lived from 1689 to 1755. He was writing and theorizing under the absolute, unchecked monarchy of King Louis V of France.
The political reality of 18th century France was nothing like a modern democracy. There were no political parties, there was no universal suffrage, there was no modern administrative state.
The famous system of checks and balances that Montesquieu designed was specifically, purposefully engineered to solve the acute problems of his specific era.
Namely, how do you intellectually justify restraining a king who claims absolute divine right, and how do you legally empower regional parliaments to check that king's decrees?
He was designing a dam to hold back a very specific river, but the professor argues that the environment has entirely changed.
Montesquieu did not foresee and could not have foreseen the incredibly complex structures of modern governance. He did not foresee modern representative democracies scaling to hundreds of millions of people.
He certainly did not foresee the rise of massive, entrenched, heavily funded political party oligarchies.
And perhaps most importantly, he did not foresee the modern phenomenon of a perpetual, frustrated political minority. The professor argues that modern political diseases require modern structural cures.
Let us look at how the 300-year-old blueprint fails today. In many parliamentary or presidential systems, the executive is fully controlled by the exact same political party.
Right. A prime minister is usually the leader of the majority party in parliament.
Exactly. And when the party whip controls the parliament fundamentally ceases to effectively control or check the prime minister. The separation of powers, the very thing Montesquieu is trying to achieve, collapses.
It merges into a single, unified block of power acting in lockstep. Because this modern reality of party dominance exists, the professor insists that a dedicated, completely independent fourth control branch is an absolute mechanical necessity.
A branch whose sole constitutional mandate is to audit, investigate, and measure deviations in the other three branches. Relying on a 300-year-old three-branch model to solve a 21st century party oligopoly is, in his view, structural negligence.
Okay, that addresses the historical critique. Let us move to the second major objection raised by his audience, which is about the sheer system complexity.
Listeners and participants have complained openly about this. They state that this new architecture, with its mathematical axioms, economic triads, fourth branches of government, and distinct voting phases, is simply too complex.
They worry the average citizen will not understand how it works, and therefore it will be functionally impossible to implement.
The professor addresses this concern not with more theory, but with a highly effective grounded analogy regarding automotive engineering. He compares simplistic political systems to an old Renault 4 automobile.
For those unfamiliar, the Renault 4 was a notoriously basic, utilitarian French car from the 1960s. It was incredibly basic. The Renault 4 is mechanically simple. Almost anyone with a basic set of tools can open the hood and understand exactly how the engine works.
You can see the carburetor, the spark plugs, the fan belt. It is transparent.
But, as the professor points out, it is also obsolete, incredibly slow, and by modern standards, catastrophically unsafe in a collision.
He then compares his proposed, highly algorithmic political system to a modern high-end automobile.
If you open the hood of a vehicle manufactured today, the engine compartment is vastly, almost incomprehensibly complex to the average person. It is covered in plastic shielding. There are dozens of sensors, complex computer chips mapping fuel injection algorithms, intricate anti-lock braking systems.
Deployment mechanisms for multiple airbags. It requires specialized diagnostic software just to understand what is happening inside it.
But, and this is the crux of his argument, for the driver sitting inside the cabin, the interface is incredibly simple. In fact, it is far simpler than the old Renault.
You don't even need a key. You just press a button to start it. You push one pedal to go, another to stop. The dashboard tells you exactly what you need to know, and the ride itself is smooth, quiet, and remarkably safe.
The takeaway here is profound, and it challenges a deeply held bias in democratic theory. He asserts that a state's political system must operate on the exact same principle as the modern car.
The interface for the average citizen, the act of casting a ballot, the way they interact with their local municipal government, the process of paying taxes, must be exceptionally simple and intuitive. The citizen shouldn't have to be a constitutional scholar to participate.
Correct. But the engine running behind that interface, the checks, the balances, the algorithms preventing corruption, the 11th axiom, the independent fourth branch, must be highly complex.
The complexity is required to prevent systemic crashes and to ensure a safe, stable ride for society as a whole. Demanding a politically simple state architecture, he argues, is the equivalent of demanding to drive a car with no seatbelts, no airbags, and manual drum brakes, simply because it is easier for you to understand how it works.
You are trading necessary systemic safety for the illusion of comprehension.
That is a brilliant reframing of the complexity argument. Now, from the mechanics of the system's engine, the lecture then transitions into the practicalities of how people actually enter and operate within the system. How are politicians vetted, and how do they communicate with the voters?
This brings us to another highly controversial proposal in the source material, the requirement of a state exam.
Yes, the professor proposes a hard rule. Politicians must pass a rigorous state exam before they are legally permitted to take office or perhaps even stand for election.
Critics immediately label this as deeply fundamentally undemocratic. The prevailing democratic theory argues that the people should have the absolute right to elect anyone they choose to represent them, regardless of that person's formal qualifications or education.
The professor defends this requirement by asking the audience to look at the baseline standards we apply to almost every other vital function in modern society. He notes that basic state clerks, people sitting behind a desk, processing municipal paperwork or issuing licenses, are routinely required to pass civil service exams to prove they understand the administrative laws they are tasked with applying.
He extends the analogy to the maritime industry, comparing the state to a ship. Sailors, before they are allowed to take responsibility for a vessel, must pass rigorous exams. They must prove they know how to tie critical knots, how to read a compass azimuth, how to navigate by the stars.
How to handle the vessel safely in a storm. You would never allow a group of passengers on a cruise ship to simply vote for one of their own to pilot the ship across the Atlantic Ocean if that person had absolutely zero maritime training. It would be collective suicide.
Therefore, the professor asks, why shouldn't the captain of the ship of state, the politician who is writing the laws, directing the military, and managing a multi-billion-dollar budget, be required to pass a standardized exam proving they actually understand the Constitution, basic economics, and administrative law?
It is an argument for mandating a baseline of objective competence before handing over the keys to the machinery of state. But competence is only one part of the equation. How a candidate communicates that competence to the public during an election is the other.
And this brings the lecture to a scathing critique of modern political campaigns. The professor identifies a severe structural flaw in how politicians currently communicate with the electorate. Modern campaigns are heavily, almost exclusively, dominated by capital.
They rely on vast sums of money, specialized marketing firms, targeted television advertising, and algorithmic social media manipulation. Because of this hyper-commercialized environment, the actual political discourse degrades.
Deep policy debates are replaced by sound bites, aesthetic posturing, and vicious personal attacks. He uses a somewhat humorous but incredibly pointed example to illustrate this.
He suggests that politicians today spend their expensive television time arguing you have a big nose or you have big ears, rather than debating the actual mathematical merits of infrastructure spending, healthcare logistics, or tax reform.
The democratic debate is hollowed out. It becomes a spectacle of ad hominem insults rather than a serious contest of ideas. To structurally fix this degradation, the professor proposes what he calls the voting booklet solution.
This is a fascinating, almost aggressively analog mechanical intervention in the modern campaign process. How does it mechanically work? Because it sounds incredibly simple on the surface.
The proposal dictates that the state itself takes total responsibility for the primary distribution of campaign material. Months before an election, the state prints and physically distributes a standardized, comprehensive booklet to the home of every single registered voter.
For every candidate running for an office, this booklet enforces a strict, unyielding format. Walk us through that format.
First, the candidate is allocated a specific amount of space to provide a clear statement of their platform and policy goals. Second, there is a dedicated section containing direct rebuttals from their opponents regarding that specific statement. And third, the original candidate is given a final allocated space to respond to those rebuttals.
Let's truly consider the systemic impact of this. Why does a state-printed booklet matter so much in an era of digital media? First and foremost, it mathematically equalizes the financial playing field of the election.
Imagine a candidate backed by millions of dollars in corporate funding. In the current system, they buy every billboard and dominate the airwaves. But with the voting booklet, that millionaire candidate gets the exact same amount of page space, the exact same font size as a grassroots candidate with absolutely zero funding.
Both platforms reach every single voter's kitchen table equally. Furthermore, it fundamentally alters the psychological nature of the democratic conversation. It strips away the noise, the polished television aesthetics, the ominous background music and attack ads, and the marketing spin.
It forces politicians to run on actual, written, verifiable policy commitments.
If you only have a few paragraphs in a booklet to convince a citizen to vote for you, you literally cannot waste that precious space saying your opponent has a big nose. You have to articulate your plan. You have to defend your numbers against written rebuttals.
It forces the public discourse back to substance simply by changing the medium of communication. This is a perfect example of his architectural approach. He isn't trying to change human nature. Politicians will always want to attack each other. He is changing the systemic constraints so that the most effective way to win is by debating policy.
Which brings us to a pivotal shift in the lecture. Up until now, we have been discussing the professor presenting his theories and defending them against past critiques. But the source material details a moment during the live Q&A session where the deep dive becomes truly interactive.
An audience member raises their hand and spots a massive, potentially catastrophic loophole in the architecture. This is the ultimate stress test of the system.
To fully grasp the severity of this vulnerability, we have to remind ourselves of a core, load-bearing pillar of the professor's proposed political system. Earlier, we discussed the necessity of the fourth control branch.
To ensure that the executive branch is always being watched by a highly motivated adversarial auditor, the system's algorithm mandates that the runner-up in the presidential election, the person who finishes in second place, automatically becomes the supreme controller.
They become the head of this powerful fourth branch. And initially, the logic behind that algorithm makes perfect sense. The person who most wants the president's job, the person who just fought a bitter campaign against them, is given the legal power to audit the president's actions.
They have every political and personal incentive to uncover corruption, mismanagement, or constitutional violations. It relies on weaponizing political ambition for the sake of public transparency.
But then, an audience member raises a hypothetical scenario that cuts right to the bone of this logic. They ask, what if the winning president and the runner-up secretly made a backroom deal before the election ever took place? What if they're actually from the same political kitchen?
Same kitchen, meaning a fabricated, engineered opposition. Let us map this out. Imagine a massive, dominant political coalition. They run the internal polling and realize they are absolutely guaranteed to win the election with 60% of the vote.
But under the professor's rules, winning the presidency means they hand over the powerful control branch to their bitter rivals, who poll at 40%. To prevent that, the dominant coalition deploys a strategy. They secretly run two candidates from their own ranks, candidate A and candidate B.
They publicly pretend to be bitter, ideological rivals during the campaign. They debate each other, they attack each other. But in reality, they're secretly allied, funded by the same donors, and operating from the same kitchen.
The election happens. Candidate A wins the presidency with 35% of the vote. Candidate B comes in second with 25%. The true opposition comes in third with 40%. Under the professor's original algorithm, candidate A becomes president and candidate B automatically becomes the supreme controller.
This raises an incredibly important existential question for the entire architecture. If the chief executive and the chief auditor are secretly aligned, the entire system of checks and balances collapses instantly.
The fourth branch, designed to be a sword against corruption, immediately becomes a shield to protect the executive from scrutiny. The state reverts immediately to an unchecked structural oligarchy. The auditor is essentially auditing their own teammate.
The professor, to his immense credit, does not deflect this question or try to defend his original design. The source notes that he candidly, immediately admits that if the same kitchen scenario occurred, it would be a total catastrophe for the model. The system would fail.
He acknowledges the critical vulnerability openly. And this admission prompts a remarkable moment of real-time collective brainstorming among the participants in the lecture hall. They realize the algorithm needs a patch.
Another audience member steps in and proposes a brilliant mechanical solution to the problem. The audience member suggests a modification to the algorithm.
If there is a statistical risk that the first and second place candidates might be compromised in secretly working together, the solution is to structurally expand the leadership of the control branch.
Do not just hand absolute auditing power to the runner-up. Instead, form a collegium or a ruling committee at the top of the control branch that mandatorily includes the second place, the third place, and the fourth place candidates from the general election.
The brilliance of this patch lies in the mathematical guarantee it provides. Let us revisit our same kitchen scenario. If a single massive political coalition tries to fabricate opposition, they might successfully run two candidates and capture first and second place. It requires immense resources and coordination, but it is plausible.
But to capture the entire expanded collegium, that is where the math defeats the strategy. It is mathematically and politically near impossible for one secret allied coalition to successfully run and fund four separate campaigns, pretend they all hate each other, fool the entire electorate, and successfully capture the first, second, third, and fourth place finishes without the public or the press realizing it is a coordinated sham.
The fragmentation of votes alone would likely cause them to lose the presidency entirely. By expanding the auditing body to include the lower-placing candidates, the system algorithmically guarantees that someone with true, verifiable, and highly motivated opposition motives is physically sitting in the room, holding subpoena power, and auditing the president.
Even if first and second place are corrupt, third place is there to pull the fire alarm.
The professor's reaction to this proposed patch is immediate. He doesn't ask to take it offline to study it. He enthusiastically accepts the idea on the spot. He states that it perfectly addresses the vulnerability without compromising the core axioms, and he promises the audience that he will build this patch into the system architecture ASAP.
It is a truly remarkable moment to analyze. It is a perfect live-action illustration of the system being iteratively improved, stress-tested, and patched by the very citizens it is eventually meant to serve. It treats constitutional design not as philosophy, but as an engineering discipline.
It demonstrates that a functional political architecture cannot be a rigid dogmatic text handed down from on high by a solitary genius. It must be viewed as a flexible, complex algorithm that can and must be updated when logical flaws or vulnerabilities are discovered by the collective intelligence of the society using it.
As we summarize the extensive journey we have taken through the source material today, we have traveled a considerable distance. We started by examining the slow, honest, but ultimately paralyzing inefficiencies of pure direct democracy in the student plenums.
We navigated the complex mechanical requirements of the 11th axiom to structurally prevent compromised, captured appointments.
We explored the theoretical economic triad, separating active, value-creating entrepreneurs from passive, value-extracting speculators.
We contextualized the necessity of a fourth branch of government against the historical backdrop of Montesquieu, and we used the modern automobile to understand why a state must possess deep systemic complexity to provide a simple, safe interface for its citizens.
And finally, we witnessed the rigorous real-time stress testing of the architecture, resulting in a crucial mathematical patch to the control branch to prevent the same kitchen oligarchy.
All of this highlights a fundamental shift in how we might need to view the structures of human governance. We perhaps need to stop viewing them as permanent, sacred monuments and start viewing them as complex, highly stressed machinery requiring constant maintenance and diagnostic review.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over, building on the concepts we've unpacked today.
If optimal political systems are, in essence, complex mechanical algorithms that require constant stress testing, public debugging, and algorithmic patching to remain functional and uncorrupted, what does that mean for our traditional reverence for static, centuries-old written constitutions? Is the future of human governance destined to look less like a sacred historical text carved in stone by long-dead founders, and more like open-source software, constantly audited, updated, and ruthlessly debugged by the people who rely on it to survive every single day? Thank you for taking the time to explore these concepts with us. Until the next deep dive.